The mysterious stranger on the Paris to Stamboul train. Par ici, madame. A tall woman, wrapped in a luxurious mink coat, glided along the Gare de Lyon's platform, her porter struggling with the heavy bags trailing behind her. She wore a dark brown knitted hat pulled low over one eye, the other side revealing a stunning profile framed by golden curls that cascaded over her ear like the softest silk. An epitome of grace and charm, she was the picture of sophistication, and it was impossible for any man to miss the way heads turned as she walked past the train's carriages. The signs on the sides of the carriages flashed. Paris, Athens, Paris, Bucharest, Paris, Stamboul. At Stamboul, the porter halted abruptly, unstrapping her suitcases and letting them thud to the ground with a soft crash. He gestured politely. "Voici, madame." A sharply dressed conductor, spotting her from a distance, hurried to greet her with an eager, "Bonsoir, madame," his voice thick with reverence for her opulent coat. He took the flimsy sleeping car ticket she handed him and led her inside, nodding briskly. As she rushed down the narrow train corridor, she almost bumped into a large, portly gentleman emerging from the compartment next door. For a fleeting second, she glimpsed his round, benevolent face, eyes gleaming with unspoken kindness. "Voici, madame," the conductor called, showing her into a compartment. The compartment was cozy, hot, and yet she made no effort to remove the heavy coat. She placed her scarlet case and handbag beside her, her gaze fixed outward, beyond the bustling station. People rushed past, offering pillows, newspapers, chocolate, and water. Her eyes glazed over them. It was as if the world outside no longer existed for her. "Madam, your passport." The conductor's polite request seemed to fall on deaf ears. She snapped out of her reverie, startled. "What? Oh, my passport." She handed it over without a word, still distracted, her mind elsewhere. After a brief exchange, where he reassured her everything was in order, the conductor revealed something odd. "I shall be traveling with you as far as Stamboul." She handed him a 50-franc note, nodding absent-mindedly. As he left, the sound of frantic bell ringing caught her attention. The restaurant attendant, calling for premier service, dashed by. Elsie rose to make her way to the dining car, shedding her coat as she did. But as she stepped into the corridor, she paused. The mysterious stranger on the Paris to Stamboul train. Par ici, madame. A tall woman, wrapped in a luxurious mink coat, glided along the Gare de Lyon's platform, her porter struggling with the heavy bags trailing behind her. She wore a dark brown knitted hat pulled low over one eye, the other side revealing a stunning profile framed by golden curls that cascaded over her ear like the softest silk. An epitome of grace and charm, she was the picture of sophistication, and it was impossible for any man to miss the way heads turned as she walked past the train's carriages. The signs on the sides of the carriages flashed. Paris, Athens, Paris, Bucharest, Paris, Stamboul. At Stamboul, the porter halted abruptly, unstrapping her suitcases and letting them thud to the ground with a soft crash. He gestured politely. "Voici, madame." A sharply dressed conductor, spotting her from a distance, hurried to greet her with an eager, "Bonsoir, madame," his voice thick with reverence for her opulent coat. He took the flimsy sleeping car ticket she handed him and led her inside, nodding briskly. As she rushed down the narrow train corridor, she almost bumped into a large, portly gentleman emerging from the compartment next door. For a fleeting second, she glimpsed his round, benevolent face, eyes gleaming with unspoken kindness. "Voici, madame," the conductor called, showing her into a compartment. The compartment was cozy, hot, and yet she made no effort to remove the heavy coat. She placed her scarlet case and handbag beside her, her gaze fixed outward, beyond the bustling station. People rushed past, offering pillows, newspapers, chocolate, and water. Her eyes glazed over them. It was as if the world outside no longer existed for her. "Madam, your passport." The conductor's polite request seemed to fall on deaf ears. She snapped out of her reverie, startled. "What? Oh, my passport." She handed it over without a word, still distracted, her mind elsewhere. After a brief exchange, where he reassured her everything was in order, the conductor revealed something odd. "I shall be traveling with you as far as Stamboul." She handed him a 50-franc note, nodding absent-mindedly. As he left, the sound of frantic bell ringing caught her attention. The restaurant attendant, calling for premier service, dashed by. Elsie rose to make her way to the dining car, shedding her coat as she did. But as she stepped into the corridor, she paused. Elsie sat back, her thoughts spinning. She felt a strange calm settle over her at the mere presence of Mr. Parker Pyne. It was as though, in his company, everything might make sense. Finally, she exhaled, as if releasing a long-held secret. "Yes," she admitted, her voice low. "I am unhappy. At least, I'm worried." Mr. Pyne nodded sympathetically, his expression kind yet inscrutable. "You see," Elsie continued, her hands clasping the edge of the table as she spoke, "something very strange has happened, and I don't know what to make of it." "Suppose you tell me about it," he encouraged, his tone gentle but insistent. Elsie chewed on her lip, uncertain. She remembered the advertisement, the one she had laughed about with Edward, her husband. Never once had she thought she'd be standing here, confiding in this man. But there was something reassuring about him. He looked, well, nice. Almost too nice. She made up her mind. Anything to release the weight of the worry she'd carried since that day. "I'll tell you. I'm on my way to Constantinople to meet my husband. He's been there for the past fortnight, working on some business. We've only been in England for 6 months, but I've been so excited. I've never been abroad before." "And you and your husband are both Americans?" Mr. Pyne asked, his curiosity piqued. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft. "We've been married for 1.5 years. Happy then?" "Oh, yes," she said quickly, a fond smile pulling at her lips. "Edward's an angel. Well, he's a little strict. He comes from Puritan stock, you see. But he's a dear," she added, almost as if trying to convince herself. Mr. Pyne observed her for a moment before he said, "Go on." Elsie leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "About a week after Edward left, I was writing a letter in his study. The blotting paper was new, except for a few lines of writing. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then, I don't know why, I held it up to a mirror. I swear, Mr. Pyne, I wasn't spying. Edward is the mildest man you'd ever meet." But there it was. Mr. Pyne didn't interrupt. "I saw it clearly. The first word was wife, then Simplon Express, and lower down, just before Venice would be the best time." She stopped, the words hanging in the air between them. "Curious," Mr. Pyne mused, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Distinctly curious. Was it your husband's handwriting?" "Oh, yes," Elsie replied quickly, her eyes searching his. "But I've been racking my brain ever since. Why would he write something like that? And why in such an odd way?" Mr. Pyne repeated the cryptic words softly, as if weighing their meaning. Just before Venice would be the best time. Elsie's gaze was intense, a mix of worry and hope. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid," Mr. Pyne replied slowly, "we shall have to wait. Wait until just before Venice." He picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open casually. "Here's the schedule. The Simplon Express arrives in Venice at 2:27 tomorrow afternoon." They exchanged a brief glance. Something was about to unfold, something neither of them could predict. The next day, as the clock ticked toward 2 in the afternoon, the train finally approached Venice, although it was running 11 minutes late. Elsie sat in her compartment, her heart pounding. Mr. Pyne beside her, calm and unshaken. If anything were to happen, it would be now. And they both knew it. Elsie's eyes darted nervously between the corridor and the seat opposite her, her fingers tightly clutching the edge of her dress. "Keep calm," Mr. Pyne said, his voice a steady anchor. "You're quite safe. I'm here." But as if on cue, a scream shattered the stillness of the train. "Oh, look, look, the train is on fire!" Elsie's heart leapt in her chest as she and Mr. Pyne rushed into the corridor. A frantic woman, her face pale with fear, was pointing toward the front of the train, her finger trembling. Out of one of the compartments ahead, thick black smoke billowed in a heavy cloud. Mr. Pyne and Elsie sprinted down the corridor, the chaos around them growing as others rushed to join them. The compartment in question was full of smoke. A few brave souls approached, only to recoil, coughing violently. The conductor appeared at the scene, his voice surprisingly calm amid the frenzy. "The compartment is empty," he shouted, his hands raised in a gesture of reassurance. "Do not alarm yourselves, mesdames et messieurs. The fire will be controlled." But the panic was far from over. Questions filled the air, all jumbled together. The train had crossed the bridge that linked Venice to the mainland. Suddenly, Mr. Pyne turned sharply, pushing through the small crowd of passengers and heading back toward Elsie's compartment. She followed quickly, fear gripping her chest. With every twist of fate, it seemed, things were only just beginning to unfold. Would the mystery she'd uncovered unravel in time, or would it leave her in the dark? Only Venice and Mr. Parker Pyne held the answers. The mysterious case of the missing jewels. A train ride to remember. The train sped along the tracks, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels filling the compartment as Elsie and Mr. Parker Pyne sat facing each other, their quiet conversation interrupted only by the occasional movement in the corridor. The incident earlier with the smoke bomb still lingered in the air, but now there was a different kind of tension brewing in the carriage. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. The Slav lady, her face pale from the shock, burst into the compartment, gasping for air as though she had just run a marathon. "Excuse me, madam." Mr. Pyne's voice was firm, his tone not at all rattled. "This is not your compartment." The woman turned to him, eyes wide with a mix of embarrassment and fear. I know," she muttered, flustered, waving her hand dismissively. "It's just the shock, the emotion. My heart." She sank back onto the seat, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Mr. Parker Pyne, his calm demeanor unwavering, stood in the doorway. His voice was soothing yet authoritative. "You must not be afraid. I don't think for a moment that the fire is serious." The Slav lady's face softened, as if hearing his words was a balm to her frayed nerves. "Not? Oh, what a relief. I feel restored." She half rose, ready to return to her own compartment, but Mr. Pyne stopped her with a gentle but firm gesture. "Not just yet," he insisted, his hand pressing her back into the seat. "I will ask you to remain here for a moment." The woman's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the chilling authority in Mr. Pyne's voice silenced her. "Madam, you will remain." Elsie, who had been observing the scene from the sidelines, stepped forward. "It seems it was a smoke bomb," she said, breathless with the excitement of the situation. "Some ridiculous practical joke. The conductor's furious. He's asking everyone." She broke off mid-sentence. her eyes landing on the second occupant of the carriage, the Slav lady. Mr. Pyne, ever the keen observer, turned his attention to Elsie. "Mrs. Jeffries," he began, his voice taking on a tone of quiet seriousness, "what do you carry in your little scarlet case?" Elsie's eyes shifted to the case in her lap. "My jewelry," she replied with a puzzled expression. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to check and see if everything is still there." A torrent of words spilled from the Slav lady, her language rapid and urgent as she switched to French, her hands fluttering as she spoke of the injustice of it all. Meanwhile, Elsie had already opened her jewel case and let out a gasp. "Oh!" she cried, her voice shaking. "It's unlocked!" The woman from across the aisle was still ranting, but Elsie barely heard her. Her gaze locked on the open case, the jewelry that had once gleamed in the velvet-lined interior, gone. "They're gone!" Elsie exclaimed, her voice cracking with panic. "Everything! My diamond bracelet, the necklace Pop gave me, the emerald and ruby rings, my beautiful diamond brooches. Oh, thank goodness I was wearing my pearls. Mr. Pyne, what should we do?" The ever-composed Mr. Pyne took immediate action. "If you will fetch the conductor," he instructed, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable sense of purpose, "I will ensure this woman does not leave this compartment until he arrives." The Slav lady's reaction was one of pure outrage, her shrill cries filling the compartment. She continued her tirade of insults as the train pulled into Venice. The next 30 minutes were a whirlwind of confusion, as Mr. Pyne navigated through a sea of officials, each one more eager than the last to clear up the situation. The accused woman was searched, thoroughly, but to no avail. The jewels were nowhere on her. But Mr. Pyne was not easily deterred. Between Venice and Trieste, he and Elsie sat in silence, reflecting on the case and piecing together the puzzle. "When was the last time you saw your jewels?" Mr. Pyne asked, his voice a low murmur. "This morning," Elsie replied, still shaken by the theft. "I took out a pair of sapphire earrings and replaced them with plain pearls. And all the jewelry was there, intact." "Well, I didn't go through it all, but it seemed fine. A ring or something might have gone missing, but nothing more." "Interesting." Mr. Pyne nodded thoughtfully. "Now, when the conductor made up your compartment this morning, I had the case with me in the restaurant car. I always take it with me. I've never left it anywhere, except just now when I ran out to meet you." Mr. Pyne's mind was already racing. That means the thief must have been in the compartment for only a minute, just long enough to open the case with a duplicate key and take the jewels. But what next? Elsie, following his train of thought, suggested, could she have handed them off to someone else? Mr. Pyne shook his head. "Hardly. I was just outside the door when she came in. If anyone had passed through, I would have seen them." Elsie's brow furrowed as she considered other possibilities. Maybe she threw them out the window to someone? Mr. Pyne's lips twitched with a faint smile. "An excellent suggestion, Mrs. Jeffries, but the train was on a bridge at that very moment passing over the sea. No one could have caught the jewels." Then Elsie hesitated, eyes narrowing in thought. She must have hidden them in the compartment. Mr. Pyne's face lit up with a small, knowing smile. "Exactly. Let's search." Elsie, now fully energized by the challenge, sprang into action, rummaging through every nook and cranny of the compartment. Mr. Pyne, however, appeared to be distracted, his mind elsewhere. "I'm thinking I must send a rather important telegram in Trieste," he explained, a faint air of detachment in his tone. Elsie paused, momentarily exasperated by his lack of urgency. "You know, you haven't been very helpful." "My dear lady," Mr. Pyne said, his tone suddenly meek, "you must remember I am not a detective. Theft and crime are not my area of expertise. The human heart, however, is, Elsie couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Well, I was a bit unhappy when I got on this train," she admitted with a smile. But as they continued their search, the mystery of the missing jewels seemed to deepen, and the path to discovery grew ever more tangled. What had seemed like an easy case was turning out to be far more complex than either of them had anticipated. The hidden truth and a revelation at the Café Elsie sat in Mr. Parker Pyne's private sitting room, the small stout cardboard box in front of her trembling hands. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her jewelry, her beloved rings, brooches, bracelet, and necklace, all neatly placed inside. "Oh, Mr. Pyne," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "How marvelous! How too wonderful!" Mr. Parker Pyne smiled, his usual calm but reassuring demeanor. "I'm glad not to have failed you, my dear young lady." Elsie's gratitude was overwhelming, but a wave of guilt followed. "Oh, Mr. Pyne, I've been so horrid to you since Trieste. I treated you so poorly, and now this. But how? How did you get them back? When? Where?" Mr. Parker Pyne took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful. "It's a long story," he said, his voice calm yet enigmatic. "You may hear it one day. In fact, you may hear it quite soon." "Why not now?" Elsie's curiosity was now relentless. "There are reasons," he said, his tone soft but final. Elsie had to accept his words and left, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. As she walked out, Mr. Parker Pyne took up his hat and stick, stepping out into the streets of Pera. The city was bustling with life, but his thoughts were far away. He strolled slowly, reaching a quiet cafe overlooking the Golden Horn. The view was breathtaking, the minarets of Stamboul stretching elegantly against the afternoon sky. It was serene, beautiful, and peaceful. He ordered 2 coffees, the thick, sweet liquid arriving as he sat back and sipped, lost in thought. It was then that a man slipped into the seat opposite. Mr. Pyne glanced up, his smile never leaving his face. "I've ordered some coffee for you," he said, nodding towards the cup. Edward Jeffries pushed the coffee aside and leaned forward, his gaze intense. "How did you know?" Mr. Pyne sipped his coffee leisurely, savoring it as he replied dreamily. "Your wife must have told you about her discovery on the blotter?" Edward looked at him, confused. She didn't mention any blotter to me." Mr. Pyne chuckled softly, as if remembering a far-off thought. "Oh, but she will tell you eventually. It slipped her mind for the moment." He proceeded to recount the details of Elsie's discovery of the mysterious phrase, the one that had confused both her and Mr. Pyne earlier. Edward listened intently, his face growing more somber as he absorbed the information. "Very well," Mr. Pyne continued. "That phrase, 'just before Venice,' linked up perfectly with the curious incident that happened just before Venice." Edward's brows furrowed, his confusion deepening. "What are you talking about? I don't understand." "Let me explain," Mr. Pyne said. "You, my dear Mr. Jeffries, were engineering the theft of your wife's jewels, but the phrase 'just before Venice' seemed nonsensical. Why not let your accomplice choose the time and place on her own?" Edward stared at him, his mouth dry. "Then suddenly I saw the point," Mr. Pyne continued, sipping his coffee slowly. "Your wife's jewels were stolen before you even left London, replaced by paste duplicates. But that didn't satisfy you, did it?" Edward remained silent, his hands tightening into fists. "You're a high-minded, conscientious man," Mr. Pyne pressed on. "You have a horror of any innocent person, servant or otherwise, being suspected. A theft had to occur, but only in a way that left no suspicion on anyone from your household or acquaintances." Edward leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "Your accomplice was supplied with a duplicate key to the jewel box and the smoke bomb. At the right moment, she raised the alarm, rushed into your wife's compartment and triggered the scene. But why? Why not just take the jewels and be done with it? Edward didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Because you wanted a show, Mr. Pyne explained, his tone unwavering. A drama with all the right details, all the right timing. So, while Elsie panicked over losing her jewels, you could step in and retrieve them later, ensuring no suspicion would fall on anyone else. Edward rubbed his temples, the weight of Mr. Pyne's revelation pressing down on him. It was never about the jewels, Mr. Pyne added quietly. It was about control, about protecting appearances. Edward finally looked up, his face a mix of regret and resignation. How did you know all this? Mr. Pyne shrugged. It's not magic, Mr. Jeffries. It's observation, deduction, and a little understanding of human nature. Edward sat back in his chair, the truth settling over him like a heavy fog. In the distance, the minarets of Stamboul shimmered against the twilight sky. There are some things, Mr. Pyne, Edward said quietly, that a man prefers to keep buried. Indeed, Mr. Pyne replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But sometimes the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. The unexpected lesson of truth and lies. Edward Jeffries sat there, his hands trembling as he watched Mr. Parker Pyne take a sip of his coffee. The weight of his confession hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. The glittering jewels that had once been a symbol of his wife's affection now seemed like a cruel reminder of the tangled web he had woven. Mr. Pyne, ever the observer, laid out the details of the situation with a cold precision. You see, Edward, he said softly, your accomplice made sure the paste duplicates of the jewels were thrown into the sea, and she may be suspected, searched, but nothing could be proved against her. She was a clever woman indeed. After all, you needed to make sure that the jewelry was disposed of at just the right moment, the one when the train crossed over the sea. It was not just about throwing the jewels out of the window, but about the timing, the drama. Edward's mind raced as he tried to process everything. So, the whole thing was an act? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Indeed, Mr. Pyne confirmed. While you arranged for the sale of the jewels here, the whole charade was meticulously set up. You were bound by an unspoken agreement to keep the theft hidden, to avoid bringing suspicion on anyone, and to ensure that your actions remained untraceable. But when my wire reached you, you complied, depositing the box of jewelry at the Tocatlian, knowing that otherwise I'd involve the police. Edward's face had turned pale, but he couldn't argue. The entire plan had been a house of cards, balanced precariously on lies, half-truths, and the desperate need to keep his past from catching up with him. But how did this all start? Mr. Pyne asked, his tone gentle but probing. Why go so far? You, a man so eager to do the right thing. What happened to you? Edward hesitated, his gaze falling to the table. It started with blackmail, he admitted bitterly. You've seen my wife. She's perfect, innocent, pure, untouched by the evils of the world. She's an angel, Mr. Pyne, and she believes in me. But if she found out what I've done, who I really am, she would leave me. And that's the last thing I want. Mr. Pyne leaned forward, studying him with an inscrutable gaze. And then there's a woman, isn't there? A Mrs. Rossiter from the West Indies? Edward nodded, his shoulders sagging. Before I married Elsie, I got caught up in something I shouldn't have. Mrs. Rossiter, her husband was a violent man, and one night, in a fit of rage, he threatened her with a revolver. She came to me for help. What was I supposed to do? She was terrified. I couldn't just turn her away. Mr. Pyne's expression softened, but his words were firm. And that was when the trap was set. She used your chivalry against you. You became entangled in her web, and when you tried to escape, the blackmail began. They had their hold on you. They used your guilt, your fear of your fiancé's father, your shame at the rumors, and they twisted it into control. Edward's voice broke as he continued. They sent me letters, demanding money, threatening to expose everything. They made me out to be the worst kind of man. I couldn't let Elsie know. I couldn't bear to lose her. And so, Mr. Pyne interjected, you paid. And when the pressure became too much, you took the drastic step of orchestrating the theft. You thought you could buy yourself out of this mess, but you see, Edward, you were simply playing into their hands. Edward's eyes filled with despair. What am I supposed to do now? Everything's falling apart. How do I fix this? How do I fix myself? Mr. Pyne sat back, considering him for a moment. You'll be guided by me, he said with a quiet strength. I'll take care of the people who've been tormenting you. But as for your wife, you'll have to go to her. Tell her the truth, the whole truth, except for the part where you were tricked. You see, my dear boy, women aren't looking for perfection. They don't want a saint, they want someone they can believe in. Edward blinked in confusion. You're saying I should lie? Not lie, Mr. Pyne replied, but withhold the painful truths that might shatter the image she has of you. Women don't want a hero who's never fallen. They want a man who has risen from the ashes of his mistakes. Your wife, Elsie, is in love with the idea of you, the man who has overcome his past. If you present yourself as someone who has always been good, who has always done the right thing, you risk losing her forever. You need to show her that you've struggled, that you've learned, and that you've changed. Edward sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the gravity of Mr. Pyne's words. But when there's nothing to forgive, Mr. Pyne smiled knowingly. Ah, that's where you're wrong. There is always something to forgive in a marriage. In fact, forgiveness is what keeps it alive. Without it, without the understanding that love isn't just about perfection, but about acceptance of each other's flaws, there's no relationship to speak of. Edward stood, still processing, but with a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. You really think she'll forgive me? I know she will, Mr. Pyne said with a finality that left no room for doubt. But you have to give her something to forgive. A perfect man is a dull one. A man who has faced his demons and come out the other side. That's the man she will love forever. Now go to her, be the man she thinks you are, and make her believe it. But do not let her think it's a soft job. She'll love you more for it. Edward nodded, the weight on his shoulders lifting ever so slightly. Thank you, Mr. Pyne. I don't know how to repay you. Live well, Edward, Mr. Pyne said with a smile. That will be enough. As Edward left the cafe, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be real. And with that, he walked towards his future, uncertain, but ready to face it.